determining should be eligible for reparations in the state of California. It made national and even international news. So in March, we affirmed what we call a standard. So rather than all Black folks in California being eligible for reparations, it would be a lineage standard. So African Americans, those who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. And we also discussed the criminal legal system in March as well. In April, we had our first in-person meeting in San Francisco at the historic Third Baptist Church, where we discussed unequal and separate education. And then we took a break over the summer, allowing for our anchor organizations. We hired 7 different community organizations across the state of California to organize listening sessions to allow additional space and opportunity for all Californians, regardless of race or ethnicity, to provide their input on the topic of reparations, the feasibility, what the recommendations could be in their own personal opinion. And then we resumed our formal hearings, in-person hearings actually last month in September in Los Angeles at the California Science Center, where we started to discuss international law because if you look at AB 3121, it mandates that our final recommendations must comport with international human rights law standards. So this is just a visual to show you, for instance, on the left, when AB 3121 was signed into law. So you'll see Governor Gavin Newsom, key legislators, key grassroots organizers. I think Ice Cube is there too. So it was a pretty historic moment. Governor Gavin Newsom signing AB 3121 into law, which created this task force. And then to the right is a picture of the 9-member task force, taking our oath of office at our inaugural meeting in June. Just to preface, I would like to name all the members on the task force very, very briefly. So to the top left, you have Professor Jovan Scott Lewis, who is a director of geography studies at UC Berkeley. In the middle, to the right of him, you have the Honorable Don Tamaki, who is here today with us, who was a key organizer in the Japanese American Redress Campaign. Also worked on overturning Korematsu versus United States, which every law school student probably knows about. Then we have Stephen Bradford, who is a state senator in Southern California, Lisa Holder, who is an illustrious civil rights attorney, Dr. Cheryl Grills, who is a renowned psychologist, Monica Montgomery Stepp, who is a city council member at the city of San Diego. Myself, I'm an entertainment attorney, but a repertory justice scholar as well. Assembly member Reggie Jones Sawyer, and last but not least, Dr. Amos Brown, who was a pastor at their Baptist church, was one of only 11 students to be taught by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. At Morehouse, and he is on the board of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So just to give a bit of a preface on our interim report, which again, you can find on our website that I'll share at the end of this presentation. The interim report substantiates the clear claim for reparations for the African American community. And just to give a historical overview of where that claim starts, and it goes to what our last speaker just stated in terms of it is difficult, right, to draw the precise line to say where freedom ceases and slavery begins. So right after the abolishment of slavery, right, you had conversations amongst congressional officials about how do you transition, these people who were subjugated for 200 plus years. How do you transition these people from slavery to freedom? Do you just take the chains off and let them go? Or is there going to be needed some structural intervention to ensure that there is some semblance of a transition that assists these people? And those are the types of conversations, again, that was happening in Congress right after the abolishment of slavery. So again, in 1863, we know Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution was enacted. We know that the 13th Amendment provides that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States, with the exception of a crime. We know that. But again, there's a person named Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois, who was a radical Republican, who co-authored the 13th Amendment and is cited with this particular quote, stating that it is perhaps difficult to draw the precise line to say where freedom and slavery begins. And so again, there was this struggle, a philosophical struggle at that time as to how do you assist these newly freed people. Later on in 1883, the United States Supreme Court kind of helped Congress kind of figure this stuff out. And so they interpreted the 13th Amendment, particularly Section 2. So Section 1 is around slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States with the exception of a crime. But Section 2, a lot of people don't know about, is the enabling clause. It allows for Congress to authorize or it empowers Congress to abolish all badges and incidents of slavery. So again, in 1883, the Supreme Court in the civil rights cases interpreted the 13th Amendment as empowering Congress to pass all laws necessary and proper for abolishing all badges and incidents in slavery in the United States. But what happened? Well, again, you can find this in our report. Instead of Congress utilizing its powers under Section 2 of the 13th Amendment to abolish all badges and incidents of slavery in the United States. You can find this in our executive summary of our report. Instead of Congress doing that, the United States, federal, state, and local governments, including California, perpetuated and created new iterations of these badges and incidents. And the resulting harms have been innumerable and have snowballed over generations. And so the interim report focuses on these harms. So I'll go back to quickly define what are the badges and incidents of slavery. We're throwing those terms around, but it's interesting to note that there's a legal definition around it. So for instance, Jennifer Mason McAward, she is the director of the Civil and Human Rights Law Clinic at Northwestern University. She is a 13th Amendment scholar, a law professor, and she actually provided expert testimony to the California Reparations Taskforce at our September hearing in LA last month. And she has been, writing on the 13th Amendment for years now. And so this definition on the badges and incidents of slavery comes from a law review article that she wrote in 2012 called Defining the Badges and Incidents of Slavery. And this definition is accepted by 13th Amendment scholars. And I think it's important to, raise this so that we're all on the same page in terms of what we mean by badges and incidents of slavery. So ultimately, the article concludes that the best understanding of the badges and incidents of slavery refers to public or widespread private action aimed at any racial group or population, this is key, that has previously been held in slavery or servitude, that mimics the law of slavery and has significant potential to lead to the de facto re-enslavement or legal subjugation of the targeted group. And then she goes on to state, this definition, which I outlined in bold, will assist Congress in identifying ways in which it can fulfill the 13th Amendment's promise of universal and civil political freedom. At the same time, it will provide judicially enforceable limits for the exercise of its Section 2 power within the 13th Amendment. So that's what I was stating earlier, in that the argument is that US Congress has underutilized its Section 2 power under the 13th Amendment. And in utilizing it correctly, they could actually enact reparations legislation for the African American community in order to eradicate the badges and incidents of slavery that still linger in the society and uniquely affect African Americans as an ethnic group. So again, the interim report focuses on the badges and incidents of slavery, the new iterations of these badges and incidents of slavery that the United States federal, state, and local governments, including California, have perpetuated. And we note in our report that it is impossible to identify every single badge and incident of slavery, to include every single piece of evidence, or to describe every single harm done to African Americans. So in order to address this practical reality, the report describes a sample of government actions and the compounding harms that have resulted. And we've organized it into 12 chapters, or in other words, 12 specific areas of systemic discrimination. Okay, well, I'm done. Well, thank you. This is, if you want to look at the report, these are our chapters, and this is the contact page. Thank you.
I know we're running short on time, so I promise I will be quick. But good afternoon, everyone. It truly is a pleasure to be here with you all. As was mentioned in the beginning, I'm Dr. Joanna Thompson, Director of the Office for Multicultural Learning, which also includes the Rainbow Resource Center here at SCU, and my pronouns are she, they. I'm honored to be a part of this symposium and here with you. And as I considered how I wanted to address the topic for this panel, the concept of and need for reparations, I considered the intersections of two perspectives of which I know best: my personal and professional lens as a criminologist, as well as a queer person of color working on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in higher education. For those who may not know my personal background, I was born in Virginia and raised in Maryland, the hotbed of really where this all starts, out on the East Coast. My father is a Black man born and raised in Washington, D.C., while my mother is Latina from Nicaragua, migrating to the U.S. in the 1970s. As a mixed race individual, the concept and need of reparations and need for reparations connects directly to my personal history as well as my present day reality. Academically, my bachelor's, master's, and PhD are all in the field of criminology, while professionally, as was mentioned, I've worked in higher education for over 10 years, in addition to working with an LGBTQ+ nonprofit in Chicago for about a year and a half prior to moving out here to California just a little over 4 years ago. But bringing it back to the topic of at hand, the concept of and need for reparations. I'm sure that many of us in this room have been or are currently connected to, in some way, the criminal justice system, either by our work, our education, our lived experience, a combination of all of that and more. And through those connections, we understand that the system has been less than kind to individuals who are on the margins. I lived in the Windy City of Chicago for 8 years, not only learning what it means to be a criminologist, but experiencing firsthand how to navigate and attempt to change the multiple systems which both oppress and marginalize. Throughout my 8 years of being in Chicago, I had the opportunity to work with various groups across the Chicagoland area, including the Chicago Police Department, Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the FBI Chicago Field Office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, as well as a variety of local and grassroots organizations committed to social justice. At various points throughout my time in Chicago, the idea of restorative justice came and went just like the wind that blew off of Lake Michigan. At other times, it seemed like the concepts of restoration and reparation would be a viable solution. However, those feelings of restoration and reparation being a viable solution always seemed to quickly pass, due to the heavy notion that restoration and reparation could never be a reality, due to the long-standing history of corruption in a city with deeply rooted machine politics. My time engaging in criminological work in Chicago reminded me that reparations are meant to acknowledge and repair. Acknowledge the hurt and harm done by a history of systemic oppression, which we've touched a little bit upon today, and repair the causes and consequences of said harm and hurt. From a criminological perspective, reparations should be at the heart of what we aim to achieve in the criminal justice system and beyond, so that our work may truly bolster the need for reparations in the first place. Yes, the system is broken, which we know, but that does not mean we cannot change or start over from a place of honesty, vulnerability, and authentic humanism. From a criminological lens, I believe that this work is not just about studying the harm, it is about truly understanding the harm, its origins, its various manifestations, and its impact upon society as a whole. It is about being honest about the harm, becoming comfortable with knowing that there are and have been problems, and there will most likely to continue to be barriers and challenges in the road to actualizing reparations for many communities, including African Americans here in California. I believe it is then and only then, from that knowledge generation, from the intentional silence of sitting with the impact of the trauma done to so many, may we be able to use that knowledge to intentionally repair and rebuild. Again, I am aware that many may feel from a criminal justice perspective, this can never happen, at least within the quote unquote justice system we currently have. The criminal justice system is far too punitive, far too biased, and far too destructive in its current state to engage in taking the mirror to itself to take that first step in deconstructing itself and allowing for reconstruction. However, again, I believe it can be done. In moments such as these, where allies and advocates can come together to discuss how to dismantle and recreate, we can push not only for the understanding and justification of the concept of reparations, but we can develop mechanisms for systemic change so that whatever structures may be put into place truly serve our communities and are able to do so in a genuinely equitable manner. And now let me shift gears to my work in higher education. Similar to much of our shared knowledge about the criminal justice system, I'm sure many of us have become aware that institutions of higher education across the country have been and continue to examine their relationships with the realities of history, with many institutions discovering their connections to moments of slavery, genocide, and other traumas which have been committed against historically oppressed communities. This includes institutions right here like at Santa Clara University, where we have, over the last couple of years, taken a much deeper dive into repairing and restoring our relationship with the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone peoples. In my role as director of the Office for Multicultural Learning here at SCU, I've seen many ups and many downs in the road of what could be reparations. Santa Clara has taken strides to recognize the land that we are on through our university's land acknowledgement, which we open with today. We have marked the sites where Indigenous labor has occurred and human remains exist. And we have begun to come to terms with what the notion of all of this, the land that we are on, the spaces that we take up space on, the fact that this was all stolen from Indigenous peoples. And all of this could be considered a form of repair, maybe restoration, not quite reparation just of as yet, we haven't got there. But I, along with the professional staff in our office, the student staff, many colleagues across campus, collaborators such as the School of Law, continue to ask the question, is this enough? Will it be enough? And not only is this enough for our Indigenous community, but is it enough for our other marginalized communities who live, work, learn, and pray on this traditional homeland? At the heart of why we are here today is to acknowledge and repair the hurt committed against the African American community in the state of California. And unfortunately, I do not think that we have been completely honest with ourselves about the hurt that has been caused to the African American community here, whether directly at SCU or indirectly in the state of California and many other institutions of higher education across the United States. When we look at some of those other institutions, they're finding more and more information about the enslaved peoples that were owned by their institutions. As I mentioned, being from the East Coast, conversations about these histories coming to light at universities like Georgetown and Johns Hopkins have been a part of regular conversation with friends and loved ones. In December of 2020, the president of Johns Hopkins, Ron Daniels, hosted a virtual town hall and shared with those in attendance a reaction to the evidence of Johns Hopkins, a Baltimore philanthropist and alleged abolitionist, owned enslaved Americans in the 1800s. At that time, President Daniels shared the following comment during the town hall. But what does this say about us? With many interpreting the comment as, we just don't know who we are. And that didn't sit well with a lot of folks. We cannot engage in the work of reparations if we do not commit to learning more about our history, and I think was a great way to be able to start the day. It will not be easy to learn more about our history, but we must confront the discomfort through a framework of transformative justice so that we may be able to break the cycles that have been perpetuated for far too long. Cycles of denial, which persist to this day, hold us back from engaging with members of our campus communities. We do all members of our campus communities, students, staff, faculty, administrator, alumni, a disservice if we sweep the harms of our past, present, and future under the rug. Especially in this moment when many of our students, many of whom in this room, are at the forefront of engaging in activism and allyship and advocating for concepts like reparations. The question becomes, how are we using the power and privilege of being institutions of higher education to acknowledge and repair? If we cannot answer that question through the instruction we provide, the research we engage in, the service we provide, we will continue to be complicit in the status quo. According to the International Center for Transitional Justice, or ICTJ, reparations can come in many forms, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that for the remainder of the symposium. The type of reparation depends upon the needs of the person and or communities who have been harmed and how that said harm was perpetuated. They emphasize that the design and delivery of reparations may intersect with other programs, departments, units, communities, and those who are in need, because those who have suffered at the hands of multiple systemic oppressions. Whether it is from a criminological perspective, as I've shared, or through the work done in institutions of higher education, as many of us are connected to in this room, the concept and need for reparations should be transformational, and intersectional. Transformational and intersectional in a way that we are acknowledging, repairing, advocating, dismantling, rebuilding, and healing. And as I end my words with you all today, one part of the symposium which really speaks to me is the reflection of what all of us as attendees, individually or collectively, can do to support the work of the Reparations Taskforce and help find a just solution to California's deprivation of the rights of African American Californians. In my work here at SCU, we would like to say that this is a moment of a call to action, something we emphasize at the end of every program, every workshop, because the work never starts and stops in this moment, in this room, but it truly does continue after today. And so it also provides a moment of accountability and reinforces the need for accountability from all sides. So as we think about the different ways we can engage in this moment of call to action, this moment of accountability, as we continue to consider the need of and concept of reparations, I encourage you to take the following actions, or at least consider taking the following actions. Number one, for those who are willing to speak to and investigate the truth of the history of African American Californians, do it. Speak up and speak out. Share what you know and ask questions about what you do not. And if you happen to come into this space with knowing nothing, be willing to learn more. And then continue to ask questions. We should all be willing to learn and unlearn, because without the knowledge of our history, we cannot fully engage in crafting a better present and better future. Number two, be willing to shift the narrative. Take the mirror to yourself and to others. Consider that we as a people, as a country, as a system, may not be who we thought we were, and be okay with that. We as individuals and as a collective need to reflect upon our own thoughts, actions, and behaviors so that when we do take those steps towards transformative change, we are doing so in a way that aligns with who we want to be. And number three, those who were harmed and impacted are essential to guiding the process of restoration, repair, and reparation. Reparations are not about the majority telling the minority what they need. Reparations are about the majority standing up and demanding what was rightfully theirs. This means some individuals or communities may need to take a step back, while others may need to take a step forward. And that shift is needed and much long overdue. Whatever action you may choose to take, there's a path for everyone. And remember, the worst thing that you can do is nothing at all. Thank you all for your time today, and I look forward to continuing to talk with the panelists.
Just a second, everybody. Okay, so it's a PDF. Let's give it a shot. Does that look right?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can go full screen with this. And full screen. Let me double check. Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. My name, as was said earlier, is Terrence J. Evans. I am a partner at Duane Morris, where I serve as the leader of our international banking practice. But some of the work that I'm most proud of is the work that I do for civil rights and diversity and inclusion. I have the great honor of being president of Charles Houston Bar Association, oldest Black bar in California. I'm also the director of Region 9 of the National Bar Association, which means I represent all Black lawyers, all Black judges, and all Black bar associations in the Western US. And I'm also the founder and the co-chair of the CLA Racial Justice Committee. Over the past, I would say 3 years, I've done well over 100 of these types of presentations. Just 2 weeks ago, I had the honor of giving a similar presentation to the justices of the California Supreme Court and all their staff attorneys, and also the justices of the various California Courts of Appeal. I began tracking in May of 2021 how different states around the country were responding to these types of discussions. And I'm so grateful for Santa Clara Law School for allowing us to engage in this discussion. Back in May of 2021, I noticed that there were about 14 states that had banned or were in the process of banning conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice and systemic racism. In June of 2021, we were up to 21 states that had banned these types of discussions. So in public schools and publicly owned universities. By the time we got to October 22nd of 2021, this is when I had my 9th annual citywide diversity program, we were up to 28 states. And as we look at today, we're at roughly 35 or so states that have banned these types of discussions. And some of these jurisdictions, Kentucky, for example, I'll be headed to Cincinnati next week, which is right there on the border with Kentucky. It has been criminalized. So if you are a public school teacher and you're sharing the information that all of us have shared, not only will you be fired, you will be arrested and prosecuted and jailed. So the information that we are sharing today is valuable information that people do not want others to have. In Texas, for example, more than 800 books dealing with issues of civil rights, racial justice, the history of people of color, LGBTQ issues have been banned in public libraries in Texas. So there's this real concerted effort to prevent us from having this discussion, and I'm glad that we're having it. Most of my discussion today is going to focus on California's systemic racism and the case for reparations, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things that became apparent to me as I did my research, and that is slavery in the United States began before 1619. I know 1619 is a popular date. We have the 1619 Project, but there is a lot of evidence that the very first ship bringing African slaves to what is now the United States arrived in 1539, so about 80 more years of slavery. In the materials, I go through a lot about the history of slavery and plantation slavery being started here in the United States by the British, and the fact that African people built the infrastructure of what became the United States. So when we talk about all American and what built this amazing country, it was built on the backs of Black people. I think it's also important to recognize what it looked like, because we talk a lot about slave ships, slaves coming over here to the United States. This is an example of what it looked like. They were crammed in there, many times having to lie in their own feces, their own urine. If they got sick, they were thrown overboard. It was a really terrific and horrific experience for these folks. This is an example of a bill of sale that was talked about earlier today, where Africans were being offered for sale in the United States, just like you would sell a used car. Pictures of what the slave auctions look like. You were inspected as if you were a piece of property. So just examples of all of that. The very first police forces in the United States were to recapture slaves and also to enforce these black codes and these racist laws that basically restricted the ability of Blacks to involve themselves in society. And these are just examples of what some of these black codes look like. We're going to focus specifically on California. I also think it's important to dispel this notion that California has been this progressive oasis. When we talk about California, we think about, oh, it's a blue state. We do the right things here. We're an example to the rest of the country. The reality is that California has had a very long and intense racist history. In California, which became a state in 1850, our very first governor, who's pictured here, Peter Burnett, he was from Tennessee. He was a segregationist, and he worked very hard to keep people of color out of this state. He specifically pushed for laws to keep Blacks out of the state. He pushed for laws to eradicate, exterminate Native Americans, also to keep Asians out, to keep Hispanics out. In California, for approximately 100 years, and in some cases more than 100 years in California, we had a number of Jim Crow laws that barred non-whites from testifying in any case where a white person was a party. And we're going to get into specific cases and citations so that you can see this for yourself. But if you were in California during this period of time and you look like me or any of these panelists, you couldn't testify against a white person. It didn't matter if it was a criminal case, if you were robbed, if you were raped, if you saw somebody murdered, if somebody did something to your property, you were not allowed to testify. You were barred from serving on a jury if you looked like me in California. You were barred from voting. We talk about voting rights. We often think about the South, thinking that that was a Southern issue. Here in California, people of color were prevented from voting, also prevented from holding elective office, prevented from serving as judges. You wonder why people of color get so excited about Ketanji Brown Jackson and all of these other judges of color. It's because for more than 100 years in this country, if you look like me, if you look like these beautiful panelists, you could not be a judge, even in California. Something that many folks don't realize is that if you were fortunate enough to become a lawyer in California during this period of time, white witnesses did not have to answer your questions. You can imagine how difficult that would be to practice law, and you have a white witness on the stand or in a deposition and you want to ask them questions. Well, if you look like this, they could ignore you and not have to answer your questions. Barred non-whites from public schools, barred non-whites from buying and renting property. And we're going to look at a couple of examples of redlining where people of color were forced into certain neighborhoods. You wonder, why do we have Black neighborhoods and Asian neighborhoods and Hispanics? It wasn't because we just all wanted to live together and be happy. It's because there were places in the city where you could not live. You couldn't get a loan. You couldn't rent property. There was discrimination in California in cemeteries. I grew up in Los Angeles. I grew up in the city of Inglewood, specifically. Inglewood Cemetery, which is one of the largest cemeteries in California, discriminated. It was a white-only cemetery for many, many years, as were many other cemeteries here in California. In California, there were discrimination that prevented people of color from going to restaurants. You couldn't eat in restaurants. Couldn't go to hotels. You could not stay in a hotel, couldn't stay in a motel, and that was true for much of the country. If you traveled, you had to sleep in your car. You had to find somebody who would let you stay in their house. Barred from movie theaters, barred from theaters where they show plays, etc. Barred from pools and beaches. That was a big deal in California and all throughout the United States. People wonder why there's such a disparity in Black people having the ability to swim. Well, for decades, for generations in California and throughout the country, Black people could not swim in swimming pools, public swimming pools, or beaches. People thought that we were somehow contaminating the water. And there was a famous actress, I'm blanking on her name, I think it was Dorothy Dandridge. She was a very famous, beautiful, gorgeous Black woman. She went to a hotel, she got in the water, bathing suit, absolutely gorgeous. They drained the pool because they said she contaminated the water. Barred from hospitals. This is something a lot of people don't realize. Black people, other people of color couldn't go to any hospital. You're in an accident, you have a heart attack, you break your leg, your arm, whatever the case is, you could only go to a hospital that served people of color. My mother and all of her siblings were born at home because they were not fortunate enough to live near a hospital that served Black people. So that was a major consequence. And you think about it, if you couldn't get there in an emergency situation, you died. Barred Black people from admission to bars. We wonder why we had the affinity bars that was mentioned earlier. I'm president of the oldest Black bar. It's because you could not join a state bar. You couldn't join the ABA. You couldn't join a city or county bar if you were not white. It also impacted transportation, equal pay for equal work, and of course we had miscegenation laws. I want to get to one of the most infamous cases in California history. It's called People versus Hall. And in this case, you had a white man who had murdered an Asian man. And there were numerous Asian witnesses. They said, this is the guy who did it. We saw him do it. He was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to hanging. And there was this statute on the books here in California. It was the California Civil Practice Act 394. And it specified that no Indian or Negro shall be allowed to testify as a witness in any action in which a white person is a party. So the attorney for Mr. Hall appealed the decision and said, you know, this statute doesn't mention Asian people, but we think the term Negro is a catch-all phrase. When we hear Negro, we're often thinking that's a Black person, but he said, you know, this is a catch-all phrase. It should apply to anyone who isn't white. So the writer of this opinion was this gentleman here with the triangular hairdo. He was the youngest California Supreme Court justice in history at only 27 years old. He was the Chief Justice. And he wrote the opinion and he agreed with the attorney for Mr. Hall. And he basically said that the terms Indian and Negro and Black, all this stuff is generic. We're talking about non-white people. And so anybody who isn't white is deemed incompetent and you cannot testify. It doesn't matter if you can speak English, you're well-educated, you're successful, you are incompetent, you can't testify. This sparked outrage in the Asian community in California. They're like, what the heck are you talking about? You can't have people killing us and we're not able to serve as witnesses. You're letting people get away with murder. So they appealed to the governor, they appealed to the California legislature, said, you've got to change this. We're not going to accept it. But there was pushback. And the governor at the time, John Bigler, he actually ran on an anti-Asian platform. And not only did he love this decision, he lobbied the legislature to codify it. So in response to this horrific decision, the California legislature codified it and said, not only can people of color not testify when you get murdered or in criminal cases when you get raped, we're going to extend it to civil matters. So if somebody walks into your house and takes your house, takes your car, takes everything that you own, you can't say anything about it. You're in an accident, you can't say anything about it. You have an employment issue, you can't say anything about it. It's going to cover everything. And that's what the great state of California did. Another important case, infamous case in California history, People versus Aliyev. And in this case, you had a Turkish man who witnessed a murder. He had Caucasian features, but he had dark skin. And so the California Supreme Court said, you know, what is really the deciding factor here? Is it the dark skin or is it the physical features that make somebody incompetent? To make another long story short, the California Supreme Court was worried that white people who go out on the beach, get a nice little suntan, could lose their white privilege if they get a little bit darker out on the beach. So they said, we got to figure out a solution. So the solution was that if you are dark skinned, but you have Caucasian features, you are competent to testify. You won't lose white privilege by hanging out on the beach. But if you have African features and light skin, you know, lots of light-skinned Black people, light-skinned Asians, light-skinned Hispanics, you don't get white privilege. You are incompetent because of your physical features. And so they decided that the Turkish man who looked Caucasian was going to be able to testify. We have a long history of this discrimination, and it took more than 100 years to roll back a lot of this. And I'll just make a couple of quick things because I know the panel has to continue here. But when the 14th Amendment was passed, courts in California determined that it only applied to Black people. So it didn't confer any benefits on Asians or Hispanics. I'm gonna go through just a couple of things very quickly. They talked earlier about the 40 acres and the mule. It was really the death of Abraham Lincoln that ended that, that opportunity. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, was conservative, and that's why that plan died. They actually paid reparations to the slave owners. I just want to hit a couple of things, and then I'll wrap up here so the panel can continue. The greatest generator of wealth in American history was the Homestead Act. Hundreds of millions of acres, actually more than 270 million acres of government land was given out. People from Europe were coming over here. All these people were taking advantage of it. 99% of the benefits went to the white community. It did not go to the Black community. The New Deal legislation, which was some of the greatest legislation passed in order to bolster the middle class in this country, was specifically denied to Black people. It was enacted after World War II. You had 1.2 million Black veterans that came back after fighting for their country, but they were denied the opportunity to take advantage of the GI Bill. And what did the GI Bill do? It gave these veterans money to go to college and also their children to go to college. It gave them money to buy a house, money to start a business, and money to live off of while they were studying in college to better themselves. So you just think for a minute, if those 1.2 million Black people had been able to go to college paid for by the government, and all of their children go to college paid for by the government, and buy a house and start a business and all of that, imagine where we would be. Social Security also denied to Black folks. Just a couple of quick points, and I know I got to wrap up here. There were more than 30 massacres in this country. We talk about Tulsa, we talk about some of the famous ones that were made into movies, but there were more than 30 massacres that I counted where Black wealth was eradicated. So these were Black people who, in spite of all of the racism and all of the discrimination, they had their own cities, their own hospitals, because they couldn't go to the other hospitals, their own grocery stores, their own hotels, their own churches, their own everything. They did it all for themselves. And then you had white mobs come and burn it down and take it away. So we had Tulsa, we had Chicago, we had Springfield, we had East St. Louis, again, entire Black neighborhoods taken away. And to add insult to injury, after it was taken away, the white mob took over the property and then built their own neighborhoods. So not only did they have everything they have burned down, they couldn't even move back to rebuild. And there was no court they could go to. There was no police officer they could call. There was no judge they could go to. No one was going to help them. In all of these instances here, you see the horrible Black mob. In the materials here, I also point out that Rosa Parks was not the first one in discrimination. It was Charlotte Brown almost 100 years later. I want to go to one more example and then I'll wrap up here. When we talk about systemic racism, this one relates to Dodger Stadium. I happen to be a Giants fan, but part of the reason why I'm a Giants fan is because of this story here. So when the Dodgers moved to California from the East Coast, they needed land to build their stadium. And so obviously, they wanted to get the cheapest land possible. They reached out to city officials, and they decided they were going to use the power of eminent domain to take over one of the poorest neighborhoods in California, which happened to be Chavez Ravine. It was a mostly Hispanic neighborhood, but there were also some Black folks there. My family had property there. And so these folks refused to sell their property for crumbs. They're like, you know what, we'll give you a few dollars, get out so we can build our stadium. And these people were like, heck no, I am not giving up my house that I worked hard for if I don't get fair market value. So the police went in there and they dragged these people out. And that's what you see in these pictures, this lady being dragged out, this family being dragged off of their property by police so they could build Dodger Stadium. This is what it looked like before, beautiful area, mostly Hispanic and Black. And again, people forced out of their homes. This particular one, it always touches me when I look at it. This was a World War II hero. He had been wounded 4 times and went back and continued to fight for this country. He received medals. He was an American hero. He had a home in Chavez Ravine, and they offered him pennies for his house. And he's like, heck no, I fought for this country. I'm not taking pennies. You're not taking my house. So they went in there with a bulldozer and they bulldozed his house to teach him a lesson, to teach him who's boss. He's in front of his bulldozed house with his aunt, and he's saying, is this what I fought for? I put my life on the line for this country, and you bulldozed my house. These people never got compensated. This is another family here in California. Their house was bulldozed because they refused to sell, and to this day, they never got money. Thousands of families, mostly Hispanic and some Black, lost everything they had to build Dodger Stadium. And now we have this lovely stadium, but the Dodgers have never paid reparations to those families for what they took so that they could have their stadium. I could go on all day, but I know we got to continue. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
First, of course, I want to thank all of the panelists for their really powerful presentations. And I don't know if anybody had questions that they wrote or wanted to ask. I will take the moderator's advantage then. And Dr. Thompson addressed this question, but I wanted the panelists to advise the audience about what they can do individually or collectively to support the work of the task force and to help California find a just solution to the state's history of deprivation of the rights of African American California. And of course, there are other groups as well, but given the task of the task force, let's focus on African Americans.
Yes, so the task force meets again December 14th and December 15th in Oakland, California, location to be determined. So I know we are sort of close to Oakland. I'm from Southern California, so a bit directly challenged sometimes. But if folks want to attend in person, make sure to subscribe to our mailing list for updates. So go to oag.ca.gov/AB3121. And that's where you can subscribe to our mailing list to stay up to date on next steps for the task force.
Well, one of the things I think because of California's recent statehood, there should be a lot of documentation available on African American communities here in the state of California. And I think that we should get our students interested in researching and finding out about some of these communities in the state of California. There should be a lot of documents that one could find in various archives and state laws.
And just to clarify, what's the question?
The question is, what can people do individually or collectively to support the work of the task force and find a just solution to California's treatment of African Americans and other groups?
Sure, I think that we can do more to educate people because I think there's so much of this history that people just don't know. A lot of this I didn't know until I started researching it, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. They never taught it in school. So I think educating people, because if people understand a lot of the injustice that happened, I think they would be more supportive. I think some of the resistance comes because people just don't realize it was as bad as it actually was.
Would you like to say anything else?
No, I mean, in addition to what I shared earlier, I think, again, really just reemphasizing that education, that awareness. Even as you were speaking, I learned a lot. So, knowing that, especially in institutions of higher ed, where we're all coming from different spaces, have different experiences, different countries, how are we sharing that with one another and really building off of our lived experiences?
I want to thank the panelists. I wish we had more time because there's so much work that you've done for this, and we have so much to learn. But thank the panelists for great
How about a 10-minute break with coffee and some snacks?
You guys have done incredible. That's a lot.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, good to see you, Bryce.
The training set.